Daenerys Targaryen stood at the prow of her flagship, staring across the glimmering waters of Blackwater Bay, letting the briny wind tangle her silver-blonde hair. She could almost taste the salt on her lips. The city of King's Landing rose in the distance, a hazy sprawl of sun-baked red roofs and pale walls, with the Red Keep perched atop Aegon's high hill like a crimson crown. Far off to the north, she could see the rocky outlines of distant coves and the ephemeral silhouettes of smaller ships on the horizon. Her mind was filled with the memory of battles past. She could still see the carnage wrought by her dragons during the last campaign, the flames dancing across her vision. Yet this day was calmer. The waters under her vessel rolled with a gentle rhythm, carrying her host ever closer to a decision that might change the future of her rule. She could feel the presence of her most trusted advisors behind her. Tyrion Lannister, tall in spirit though short of stature, arms folded, brow furrowed in perpetual thought. Missandei, composed and loyal, her dark eyes scanning the harbor with unwavering attention. And Grey Worm, standing at rigid attention, his unsullied discipline second nature. None of them spoke as Daenerys watched the sails of the Iron Fleet swelling with the wind to her right. She had never imagined the day would come when she would willingly sail alongside Euron Greyjoy. Yet here she was, forging a new path. The Iron Fleet was vast, bristling with war galleys and reaver ships. Their hulls were painted with the Kraken sigil of House Greyjoy, and the sight of so many black sails evoked a tension in the air that made Daenerys' heart flutter in spite of herself. Euron Greyjoy had arrived as if conjured from some half-forgotten nightmare, making demands and offering promises in the same breath. She remembered how he had strutted before her, flamboyant and fearless, proclaiming himself the king of the Iron Islands. She had only half believed his words when he first offered an alliance, claiming his Iron Fleet as the key to her conquest of Westeros. The cost of that alliance, however, had been steep, a cost measured not only in coin but in vows. She had lost many ships to Cersei's hired fleets, had lost crucial alliances in the chaos of war, and though her dragons were powerful beyond measure, the sea was not their home. She needed a strong maritime partner to solidify her hold on the continent. Euron offered her exactly that, the greatest naval force in Westeros, manned by ironborn reavers with an unmatched taste for plunder and violence. Tyrion had argued it would be wise to consider the offer. Missandei had expressed caution, reminding Daenerys of Euron's reputation for madness and cruelty. Daenerys herself was torn, but the more she considered the terrain of the battlefield and the blood it would cost to take and hold King's Landing without a strong fleet, the more she came to see Euron's proposal as a necessary evil. She turned and glanced over her shoulder at her council. Tyrion's gaze flicked to her, searching for a sign that she was prepared for what awaited them. She gave a slight nod. That was all that needed to be said. The agreement had been signed not 2 moons past, on the deck of her flagship, as the seagulls screeched overhead and the harsh sunlight glinted off dark waters. The final step was fulfilling the public vow that would seal their 2 houses together in the eyes of gods and men. Marriage. Daenerys turned away from the rail and walked back across the deck, the boards creaking under her boots. She could sense a charged silence among the sailors as she passed. They were in awe of her presence, but also uneasy about this sudden alliance with the Ironborn. A handful of her Dothraki bloodriders stood watch near the main mast, exchanging wary glances with Euron's men. Their posture spoke of an unspoken tension that at any moment might burst into violence if either side so much as drew steel. Yet there was a brittle truce between them. No one wanted to spark an incident that would ruin this carefully negotiated moment. A flock of white gulls fluttered overhead, circling in lazy arcs. Daenerys watched them a moment, envious of their freedom. She wondered if Rhaegal and Drogon sensed her inner turmoil. Her last remaining dragons were perched on the far deck of another ship, content to watch the waves roll by and occasionally roar at passing gulls. They were restless in this watery environment, but they had become used to following her across the sea. This was yet another reason she needed Euron's support. Dragons, for all their might, could not sail. An hour later, they docked in King's Landing. The city had become hers only recently after a hard-won campaign. The War of the 3 Queens, some had called it Cersei, Daenerys, and that fleeting threat from the north when the Night King had still walked the earth. It was not so simple to hold the capital after the dust of battles had settled. King's Landing needed to be pacified, needed to accept Daenerys as its queen, and not merely the conqueror on Dragonback. She disembarked with her usual retinue, Tyrion at her side, Grey Worm leading a vanguard of Unsullied, and a small Dothraki honor guard. The people of King's Landing watched from a wary distance as she passed through the city gates. Some bowed in reverence, some peered with curiosity, and others looked on with open resentment or fear. Behind her, Euron Greyjoy strutted. He wore a flamboyant leather coat of black and gold, with a high collar that emphasized his angular features. His dark hair, windswept from months at sea, framed a face that smirked with a self-satisfied confidence. He drank in the stares of the crowd like a thirsty man at a spring, offering winks and broad smiles to any comely face that turned his way. His iron-born retinue, battered and scarred from years of raiding, followed close behind. None of them had the bearing of courtiers. They moved through the streets of King's Landing like wolves in a sheep pasture, their hands never straying far from their axes and cutlasses. Daenerys could hear the hushed whispers among the people. The Dragon Queen is marrying the Kraken King. It sounded strange even to her own ears. The rumors were swirling that Euron had demanded her hand in exchange for his fleet. Others said he had bewitched her somehow, or that he had threatened her with blackmail. The truth was far more practical, but no less unsettling. Daenerys had chosen to wed Euron to ensure a lasting partnership, to keep the seas under her control, and to foreclose any alliance Euron might otherwise make with her enemies. She did not fool herself into believing this marriage would be based on affection. For her, it was about the throne, and about preserving all she had fought to achieve. They ascended the hill to the Red Keep under the watchful eyes of the Gold Cloaks. The city guard had pledged allegiance to Daenerys after the fall of Cersei, but alliances in King's Landing were rarely permanent. She knew she had to be vigilant at all times to keep the city secure and loyal. As they crossed the courtyard into the Red Keep, the heat of the day baked the stones beneath their feet. The Unsullied parted ways to allow Daenerys and Euron to enter the grand doors leading into the keep's main hall. The Great Hall had been prepared for the ceremony. The chamber was draped in Targaryen black and red, with tall sigil banners hanging from the rafters. The Iron Throne loomed at the far end, a jagged mass of fused steel that reflected the sunlight streaming through the high windows. Though Daenerys had sat upon the throne for some time, it still felt strange to her, foreign in its sharp edges and hidden corners. Perhaps it was that the seat had belonged to her father, the Mad King, or that it had been forged by Aegon the Conqueror from the swords of his fallen foes. For all her birthright, it often felt as though she still had to prove she was worthy of it. The hall was not overflowing with lords. Many of the highborn nobles of the Seven Kingdoms had yet to pledge themselves fully, and those who had come to King's Landing still approached Daenerys with caution, uncertain how to respond to this new Targaryen queen who had once been a beggar princess across the sea. Yet the nobles that did attend offered polite bows or curtsies, while the assembled small folk who had been allowed inside to witness the royal ceremony clapped and cheered uncertainly, as though they were not quite sure if they should celebrate this union. No septon awaited them at the front of the hall, for the September of Baelor still lay in ruins, and a new High Septon had not yet been named after the last was killed in the destruction of the Great September. Instead, they had arranged for a priest of the faith to preside over the ceremony in the throne room itself. That was enough to satisfy tradition, though Daenerys cared little for such ceremonies now. She had always considered her marriage to Khal Drogo a moment of personal transformation, but this marriage was different. She felt none of that flutter of the unknown, no sense of stepping into a new life. Only the weight of strategy clung to her like a heavy cloak. Euron's steps echoed as he strode confidently to the space before the Iron Throne. He took his place, turning back to face Daenerys as she approached from the other side. His smirk was as wide as the summer sea. She met his gaze with calm resolve, refusing to show any sign of nerves. The hush that fell over the chamber grew stifling. Even the crowd seemed to collectively hold their breath. Tyrion stood at Daenerys' right, his eyes roving over the onlookers, gauging their reactions. A hush, Then a priest clad in simple brown robes stepped forward, clearing his throat. He lifted a small tome of the seven-pointed star, but his voice trembled slightly as he began the pronouncement. We gather here, in the sight of the seven, to witness the union of Queen Daenerys Targaryen, first of her name, and King Euron Greyjoy, Lord Reaper of Pike, sworn to share the burdens of rule in a realm that must know peace. The old words followed, their shape and cadence echoing in the high vault of the throne room. When asked if she took Euron Greyjoy to be her husband, Daenerys spoke a single clear word, yes. When Euron was asked if he took Daenerys Targaryen to be his wife, he responded with a flourish, loud enough for all to hear, with pleasure. The priest bound their hands together with a strip of cloth embroidered with the sigils of House Targaryen and House Greyjoy, the three-headed dragon entwined with a golden kraken. A few in the crowd stirred, uncertain whether they should cheer. Some did, and the sound reverberated off the towering stone walls. As the cloth was removed and the priest declared them wed, Euron wasted no time. He seized Daenerys' hand, planted an almost theatrical kiss on her knuckles, and then turned to the crowd, lifting both arms in a gesture of triumph. Daenerys allowed him that moment of display, keeping her own face composed in a regal mask. She was the queen of the Seven Kingdoms, and now she had a king consort, though she suspected Euron would not settle for playing the consort quietly. Even in that moment, she sensed the lust for power beneath his flamboyant exterior. Afterward, there was a feast in the great hall. The spread was generous. Platters of roast duck, spiced boar, lemon cakes, and flagons of arbor gold. Musicians plucked a lively tune, though the air remained thick with unease, as though the spirit of celebration never fully ignited. Daenerys sat at the high table beside Euron, her posture straight, her expression alert. She was dressed in a gown of black velvet, embroidered with red dragons, and wore a simple coronet over her braided hair. Euron seemed far more at ease, leaning back in his seat, jesting with whichever lords dared approach. Occasionally he whispered to Daenerys, leaning in close, his breath scented with wine and honey. "You hardly drink, my queen," he chided, pushing a goblet of wine toward her. "Is a wedding feast not a time to indulge?" Daenerys did not so much as bat an eyelash. "I have learned to keep my wits about me at all times, even or especially at a wedding." She spoke with a polite coolness that betrayed little of her personal feelings. Euron laughed, the sound booming across the high table. A few of his iron-born men joined in, raising their cups in a half-drunken toast. "Cautious as a cat with newborn kittens," he teased, turning back to the roast on his plate. "Though I assure you, my queen, I mean you no harm." His next words were murmured so only she could hear. "I only want to see you prosper, because when you prosper, so do I." Daenerys watched him through narrowed eyes. She knew that Euron's thirst for power might one day clash with her own vision for the realm. But for now, their interests aligned, at least as far as controlling the seas and subduing any rebellious lords who still clung to Cersei's memory. She sipped the wine to placate him, letting the sweet tang roll over her tongue. Across the table, Tyrion was engaged in quiet conversation with Yara Greyjoy, Euron's niece. Yara had been freed after Euron usurped her, though their relationship remained frigid, to say the least. Even so, Yara had come to the feast, perhaps out of duty. She was newly released from captivity, her short dark hair framing a face etched with resentment. Daenerys respected Yara for her bravery and had once considered an alliance with her in the past. Now, the situation was more complex, but Yara's presence was necessary. She remained the best candidate to maintain order in the Iron Islands if Euron left them. Having her at court was wise, or so Tyrion had insisted. The evening wore on. Dancers whirled across the floor. The flicker of torchlight cast long shadows against the stone walls, painting shifting silhouettes of men and women across the tapestry of House Targaryen's conquered foes. An undercurrent of tension never fully dissipated. Daenerys knew that some lords in attendance objected to a union with the Ironborn, who were infamous for their raids along the coasts. Others stared at her dragons, who were absent from the feast but perched somewhere on the walls of the keep, no doubt stirring fear in every heart that heard their distant roars. When the feast finally ended and the music stilled, Daenerys rose, her face a calm mask. Euron stood beside her, shoulders thrown back, chest puffed out as though he had just stolen something grand from the world and wanted them all to know it. Together, they withdrew from the great hall. Many watched them leave with curious eyes, speculation trailing their every step. The realm expected a bedding ceremony, that archaic custom where men would carry the bride to the bedchamber. But Daenerys had no patience for such humiliations. Her station and her dragons ensured no one would dare attempt it. Instead, she and Euron were left alone to retire for the night, bound by vow but divided by the magnitude of their ambitions. The bedchamber they entered had once belonged to King Robert Baratheon, then to Cersei Lannister. It was a grand space, with tall windows overlooking Blackwater Bay and walls draped in red velvet. A four-poster bed dominated the center, curtains drawn back in lush folds. A few candles burned, perfuming the air with honey-scented wax. Euron shut the heavy door behind them, and the latch clicked. Daenerys stood by one of the windows, pulling the stiff collar of her gown away from her neck to breathe more freely. "So," Euron said, leaning against the door, "here we are. You must be so thrilled." He spoke with a wry grin, and she could hear the faint undercurrent of mockery. Daenerys turned to face him, stepping away from the window. "The alliance is necessary. A union of House Targaryen and House Greyjoy ensures the loyalty of the Iron Fleet. That is what I wanted. That is what you wanted. Our personal feelings do not matter." "Oh, but they do, my queen," he countered with a flourish. He stepped closer, eyes glittering in the candlelight. "We're to rule together, share a bed, share a throne. We must at least tolerate each other, perhaps even grow to like each other, if we can manage it." She regarded him with measured composure. "I have no illusions about who you are, Euron Greyjoy, nor do I believe you have illusions about me. You know what my dragons can do. You know I have conquered cities across the narrow sea. I will be queen here, and if you betray me or stand in my way, I will burn your ships and leave the Iron Islands in ruins." Her words hung in the still air. Euron chuckled. "Such fire in you, Daenerys Stormborn. Your father was the Mad King, but you are something else. We both want to rule. Let's not pretend otherwise. You have dragons and an army, I have ships. The rest is details." For a moment, they said nothing, only stared at each other. Finally, Euron strode to the window, looking out over the dark waters, as though he could see his fleet anchored beyond the harbor's mouth. He pulled off one of his gloves, drumming his fingers against the windowsill. "We'll make quite the pair, dragon and kraken. None of these lesser lords will dare stand against us." Daenerys watched him as she began to unfasten the jewelry from her wrists, letting each piece clatter onto a nearby table. "All I ask is your loyalty on the seas," she said quietly. "Help me maintain order, crush any opposition, and bring stability to the realm. In return, you'll have a share of the spoils, gold, influence, and the ear of the queen." He glanced over his shoulder. "And what about your dragons? Will they heed me if I call?" "They obey only me," Daenerys said, her voice firm. "But they will leave your ships unscathed, so long as you remain faithful." He grinned, turning back to her. "Such a direct arrangement. It almost seems too simple." Daenerys sighed softly, pushing aside thoughts of what she had lost. Yora, who had died defending her. Missandei's near capture. The many ships that had been destroyed in earlier battles. She could not afford another catastrophic loss at sea. Even with the dragons, the realm was vast, the coasts vulnerable. She needed Euron more than she cared to admit. "This is the best way to secure my reign," she said, as though convincing herself as much as him. They exchanged a few more words, neither trusting the other fully. Eventually, Daenerys signaled the end of the discussion, retreating behind a folding screen to change out of her wedding gown. Euron made a few leering comments but let them drop with a roguish smile when she ignored him. The night passed in uneasy proximity. The bed was large enough that Daenerys could maintain distance if she so chose, but Euron made it clear he expected some manner of consummation. She steeled herself, remembering that this was the path she had chosen, that she had once wed Khal Drogo in a similarly strategic alliance. But this felt altogether different, as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice with a storm at her back. When dawn broke, the sunlight crept through the high windows in molten bands. Daenerys rose, dressed quickly, and left the bedchamber without a backward glance. She had duties to attend to, realms to govern, and alliances to secure. Euron stirred behind her but made no move to stop her, content to sprawl among the plush furs. As she stepped into the corridor, Grey Worm and Missandei awaited her, their expressions carefully blank, though Daenerys could sense their curiosity and concern. She offered them a tight smile, giving no explanation, and walked away with her retinue in tow. The days following the marriage were tense, as though the city itself was deciding how to regard this new king and queen. The Ironborn presence swelled within the capital, filling the harbor with row upon row of their menacing war galleys. King's Landing had never seen so many Kraken banners fluttering along its docks. The merchants complained of the Ironborn's surly behavior, while the local taverns did brisk business fueling the reaver's thirst. Yet no major incidents erupted. Any Ironborn who might have considered a riotous spree of violence thought better of it with dragons perched on the city walls. Daenerys held court in the throne room nearly every day. She listened to petitioners, settled disputes, and sought to quell any rumors that the realm was now under Greyjoy rule. She made sure everyone understood that Euron was her consort, not her ruler. Still, she allowed him a seat at her side, gave him leave to speak if he chose, and sometimes watched him with a wary side glance, unsure of what he might say or do. Euron took obvious delight in the power he was granted, though he seldom wasted it on trifling matters. He seemed content to let Daenerys play the role of regent, occasionally throwing out a jibe or a jest that left some noble or council member quaking in uncertainty. Tyrion watched all this with an inscrutable expression. The hand of the queen had cautioned Daenerys repeatedly about trusting Euron. He had been instrumental in persuading her to accept Euron's initial offer, but he remained uneasy about the man's unpredictability. One morning, after a particularly heated council session in which Euron had threatened to hang a Stormlands lord who complained about the Ironborn raiding his coastline, Tyrion approached Daenerys in the council chamber. The others had dispersed, leaving the two of them alone. "My queen," Tyrion began, pacing around the large, carved table that displayed a map of Westeros. "Euron grows bolder with each day. He's testing the boundaries of his new position. You may need to remind him, gently or otherwise, that his power extends only so far as you allow." Daenerys stood on the other side of the table, running her fingers over the painted wood that formed the outline of the crownlands. "I am aware of his nature, Tyrion," she replied, looking up, "but I will not move against him unless he breaks faith or undermines me directly." Tyrion nodded, rubbing his jaw in thought. "Still, we should be prepared. Yara Greyjoy is here in King's Landing. She despises her uncle for seizing the Iron Islands from her and nearly killing her. Perhaps we could secure her loyalty, just in case." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If Euron were to betray us, she might rally the Ironborn in your favor." Daenerys considered this. It made sense to keep a potential successor to Euron close at hand, both to curb his ambition and to ensure she would not lose the Iron Fleet if something went awry. "Speak to her," Daenerys instructed. "Gauge where her loyalties lie. I do not want to incite open conflict between the two of them, but it would be wise to have insurance." Tyrion bowed, a flash of relief crossing his face. "As you command, Your Grace." He turned to leave, but paused by the door. "And, if I may, remain vigilant. We both know the cost of trusting the wrong man." Daenerys inclined her head in acknowledgement. When Tyrion was gone, she found herself alone with her thoughts, staring at the map of Westeros. She traced her finger from the north down to the Riverlands, the Vale, the Crownlands, the Stormlands, Dorne. The realm was vast, and though she had seized it from Cersei, that victory was far from secure. The lords of these lands had bent the knee, but memories of war lingered. If House Targaryen was to maintain the peace, it needed a unified presence by land and by sea. And for that, she had married a man she hardly trusted, whose unpredictability sometimes frightened her more than she cared to admit. Time drifted forward, weeks turning into months. News arrived of small pockets of unrest in the Reach, where certain Tyrell bannermen remained discontent after the fall of Highgarden's ruling family. Reports trickled in of ironborn reavers along the coasts, plundering merchant ships in direct violation of Daenerys's decrees. Each time she confronted Euron, he would feign ignorance or claim that these were rogue elements beyond his control. She demanded he put a stop to it, and he would promise to do so, yet the next day another ship would go missing. Still, it was not all chaos. The presence of the Iron Fleet deterred larger rebellions and forced many coastal lords to accept Targaryen rule. Trade began to flow again, albeit cautiously. Her Dothraki were assigned to patrol certain stretches of the Rose Road, ensuring caravans arrived safely in the capital. Grey Worm and the Unsullied maintained order within King's Landing, chasing out the last remnants of the criminal underworld that had taken root in Flea Bottom during the transitional period. The city slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Craftsmen plied their trades, the markets bustled with vendors selling produce and trinkets, and new construction began on the site of the ruined September of Baelor, though no one quite knew how to rebuild such a structure or if Daenerys even wanted a new Grand September. She had not yet decided how to handle the faith, especially without a High Septon. But as the city attempted to heal, the memory of war hung over it like a stale odor that could not be scrubbed away. In these months, Daenerys's relationship with Euron remained guarded. They appeared together in public, presided over feasts and gatherings, and once or twice embarked on royal progresses through nearby villages. Euron often performed for the crowds like a mummer, throwing coins into the throng or boasting of the next grand conquest he and his queen would undertake. He spoke openly of sacking cities across the narrow sea, bringing the Tyroshi and Lyseni to heel. Daenerys, however, had grown weary of war. She wanted to rebuild the realm, not shatter more kingdoms for the sake of glory. Late one afternoon, the two of them walked along the battlements of the Red Keep. The sun was sinking behind the city, painting the rooftops gold and red. A breeze from Blackwater Bay stirred Daenerys's silver hair. She wore a simpler gown than usual, black and unadorned, her posture regal despite the plainness of her clothing. Euron leaned against a crenellation, gazing out at the waters far below, where the Iron Fleet remained anchored. "You must miss the sea," Daenerys observed, noting how his eyes always lingered on the horizon, as if searching for some distant adventure. Euron shrugged. "A kraken cannot be caged on land," he said casually. "But for you, my queen, I endure this confinement. Besides, it's not so bad here with the feasts and the power. I could grow accustomed to it, if only we had a bit more excitement." She studied him, uncertain if he was hinting at some new scheme. "There will be enough excitement when we pacify the Reach," she said. "I have no doubt some ambitious lords there will need a stern reminder of who their queen is." He chuckled. "I'm sure. Still, I'd like to take the fleet out for a raid. It's in my blood to conquer and plunder. Shall we sail for the Stepstones? Or perhaps take a tour around the arbor?" Daenerys's expression hardened. "That isn't part of our plan. We're not reavers. We're rulers. Plundering the arbor would only alienate the Reach further. We need the arbor's wine and trade routes intact." Euron exhaled loudly, turning back to the city. "Oh yes, we must keep our precious trade routes. Can't let the merchants go hungry." He sneered, though his tone retained its mocking humor. "You're always so concerned with the small folk. Admirable but dull." She pressed her lips together. "They are the realm, Euron. It is their loyalty and well-being that will sustain our rule. If we destroy everything in sight for the sake of conquest, we will have nothing left to rule." He shrugged. "As you say, my queen, but a little raiding never hurt anyone. The small folk should know the might of the Ironborn, so they'll learn to fear us." Daenerys resisted the urge to snap at him. This was the crux of their alliance: his thirst for violence and her desire to be a just ruler. They stood at a crossroads each day, uncertain which direction might pull them apart. She reminded herself that she needed him, needed the Iron Fleet to hold the realm together. Yet she wondered how long she could endure his provocations. "There must be a better way," she said quietly, folding her arms over her chest and looking out at the city. "We don't need to spill more blood to prove our strength. We have the Iron Throne, we have dragons, we have ships. Fear alone is not the only path." Euron barked a laugh. "Mercy, a fine notion. You tried that once in Meereen, didn't you? How did that turn out? You nearly lost the city to a rebellion of slavers. Power only respects power, Daenerys. You know this better than anyone." She felt a prickle of anger at how casually he dismissed her efforts to rule justly, but she reined it in. "I will do what is necessary," she said in a measured tone. "But I will not become my father." He eyed her with a curious gleam. "No, you're not the Mad King. But madness takes many forms, my queen. Don't let your illusions blind you." Daenerys turned away, letting the conversation drop. She stared at the city, the sound of the wind whipping her hair around her face. In her mind, she saw the ashes of war, the countless dead, and the fleeting triumph that came from standing victorious amid the ruins. She wanted to believe she could forge a better path, but standing beside Euron Greyjoy, she sensed the shadows of the old ways creeping in. Perhaps this was the price of wearing the crown. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread of more Ironborn raids. Small lords from the western coast complained that ships bearing goods from Lannisport to King's Landing had been seized. Daenerys confronted Euron in private, demanding an explanation. He shrugged off the accusations, claiming that lesser captains had acted without his leave. Daenerys threatened punishment if he did not rein in his men. Euron only smirked, saying he would handle it. Days later, a battered Lannister bannerman arrived at court. He bore witness to the brutal sacking of an outlying port and claimed the Ironborn were carrying off cargo, livestock, and even people. Daenerys's fury flared. In the council chamber, she pounded a fist against the table. Tyrion Varys, who had survived the transition of power and maintained a cautious presence, Grey Worm, Missandei, and even Yara Greyjoy were present. Euron came late, strolling in with the air of a man unbothered by trifles. "What is this nonsense about raids on the western shores?" Daenerys demanded, rising to her feet. "I gave explicit orders that the Ironborn were to cease all acts of piracy against my subjects." Euron offered a languid bow. "My queen, I assure you, I've already sent out ravens to recall those captains who have disobeyed. Discipline takes time, you understand. The men have spent generations reaving. It's in their blood." Tyrion snapped. "They are no longer independent reavers. They now serve the crown. If they cannot abide by her grace's laws, they will be punished." Euron lifted a brow, his grin all but vanished. "Punished? By whom? Exactly?" Daenerys narrowed her eyes. "By me. Do you question my authority?" He pressed his palms flat on the table and leaned forward, towering over Tyrion. His voice dropped to a menacing purr. "We may be married, my queen, but do not forget who controls the seas. You can threaten my men with your dragons, but can you chase every last one of them across every inlet and cove? It's far simpler to keep them happy and keep them from raiding your precious lords, if we provide them a constructive outlet." Yara Greyjoy chose that moment to speak up. "You mean turn a blind eye to their crimes?" She scoffed. "The Ironborn follow strength, yes, but they can be disciplined if their captain has the will. You, uncle, prefer to let them roam free like rabid dogs. Eventually, they'll bite even you." Euron flicked a disdainful gaze her way. "Spare me your moralizing, Yara. You were never strong enough to lead them." Daenerys felt the tension in the room escalate. She raised a hand, silencing both of them. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Euron, you will ensure these raids stop. Now, send your best lieutenants, send ravens, send a damn warship to patrol if you must. But if I hear of one more Ironborn raid along my coasts, you will answer for it personally." Euron stared at her for a long moment, as though testing her resolve. Finally, he inclined his head, though his expression remained stony. "As you command, my queen." With that, he turned on his heel and strode out of the chamber. The others watched in silence until the doors slammed shut behind him. Yara's face was tight with anger, her fists clenched at her sides. Tyrion cleared his throat, exchanging a worried glance with Daenerys. Varys remained quiet, observing from the shadows. Daenerys lowered herself back into her seat. Her heart hammered in her chest, a mixture of frustration and anxiety. She had foreseen tensions with Euron, but she had hoped to maintain control, to balance the Ironborn's ferocity with her own brand of justice. Now it seemed that the precarious alliance was teetering on the edge of open defiance. That evening, Daenerys found herself pacing the length of her private solar, the stained glass windows casting colored light across the polished floor. Missandei stood nearby, her calm presence a balm, though she said little. Tyrion arrived, stepping inside with a tired expression. "My queen, the situation with Euron is growing difficult," he began gently. "He will not change overnight, perhaps never. He is a man who thrives on chaos, who relishes in the fear he inspires. We've tried to bind him through marriage, but I fear the ties may be too thin." Daenerys turned, her voice breaking with frustration. "What would you have me do? Kill him and risk losing the Iron Fleet? Start another war in the midst of rebuilding?" Tyrion sighed. "No, not unless we have to, but we need a contingency plan. If Euron cannot be controlled, or if he outright defies you, we must be able to take command of the Iron Fleet somehow. Yara claims she can sway some of the captains to follow her rather than him, particularly those who despise Euron for his cruelty. If we foster that support quietly, perhaps we can stage a transition, should the need arise." Daenerys folded her arms, the weight of the crown pressing on her. "I do not wish to spark a civil war among the Ironborn, but your logic is sound. We must be prepared." Missandei spoke softly. "We may also consider awarding the Ironborn certain privileges that do not harm the realm. If they cannot raid Westerosi shores, perhaps they can patrol or escort merchant ships. If that does not satiate them, they might be permitted to raid pirate havens in the Stepstones, as a sanctioned action. We could frame it as an effort to protect trade routes." Daenerys nodded slowly. "That could be a compromise. Direct their aggression outward against actual threats." She hesitated. Though once unleashed, Euron may not stop at pirates. Tyrion's expression brightened slightly, impressed by Missandei's suggestion. "It's worth a try. If Euron is so eager to plunder, let him plunder our enemies. The Stepstones are notorious for pirate activity. Remnants of Selsail fleets, corsairs, all manner of outlaws. We could frame it as an official campaign with the Queen's blessing. The spoils belong to the Ironborn, the glory to the crown." Daenerys considered it. The realm was still recovering. A direct confrontation with pirates might prove beneficial to trade and stability. And if it kept Euron occupied, and far from her vassal shores, all the better. "Very well," she said. "We'll propose this plan to Euron. If he agrees, we'll see if it tempers his raids within the realm." So it was decided. The next day, Daenerys summoned Euron to a private audience. He arrived in his usual swaggering manner, though there was a tension to his movements. She presented the plan. Lead a royal expedition to the Stepstones to rout the pirates that plagued the shipping lanes, with the blessings of the crown and the promise of plunder for the Ironborn. At first, Euron seemed suspicious. "Is this your way of sending me off so you can conspire behind my back?" he asked, a crooked grin on his lips, yet no humor in his eyes. Daenerys met his gaze unflinchingly. "This is my way of allowing the Ironborn to do what they do best without harming the realm. If you succeed, trade will flourish, and you will be hailed as the king who rid the seas of pirates. You'll return to a grateful queen." Euron mulled it over, drumming his fingers on the hilt of his sword. "Pirates," he mused. "They can be cunning foes, but also ripe for plunder. It's been some time since the Iron Fleet had a real challenge at sea. There will be gold, slaves, contraband," Daenerys continued carefully. "All manner of spoils to be seized. With the crown's official backing, the Ironborn need not fear repercussion for it. She paused. Though I do not condone slavery, any slaves you find are to be freed. Euron glanced up, an eyebrow raised. We'll see what can be done, he said noncommittally. At least the cargo will fetch a price. Daenerys did not press the point in that moment, knowing that Ironborn minds were often slower to shift on such matters, but she made a mental note to ensure any freed captives found safe haven in the Crown's name. Do we have an agreement, then? He shrugged, his smirk returning. Aye, my queen, we do. I'll gather my captains and set sail soon. With your permission, of course. She inclined her head. You have it. The arrangement came together quickly. The Iron Fleet resupplied in King's Landing, taking on provisions and additional weapons. Euron boasted about this new campaign to anyone who would listen, calling it a grand adventure, a chance to show the world that the Ironborn were still the terror of the seas. The more pragmatic reason, Daenerys knew, was that Euron relished the chance to fight and pillage beyond the watchful eyes of her dragons. Before he departed, they shared a farewell dinner in the Red Keep. The tension between them was more subdued, replaced by a veneer of cooperation. Daenerys found she could breathe a little easier at the thought of him gone, if only for a time. As the meal concluded, Euron stood abruptly and made a grand show of kissing her hand before the assembled courtiers. Wish me luck, my queen. I shall return with enough gold and plunder to fill your coffers, though we'll likely need another few ships to carry it all. Daenerys did not smile, but she inclined her head in acknowledgement. Safe journey, King Euron. May the winds be ever in your favor. Inwardly, she prayed that the expedition would keep him occupied for long enough to maintain some stability in the capital. She also knew that his success or failure would reflect on her reign, for he sailed under the Targaryen banner now. The next day, at dawn, the Iron Fleet set forth, sails unfurled, kraken banners snapping in the wind. Daenerys watched from the walls of the Red Keep as the warships filed out of Blackwater Bay and disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving only the smell of salt and the screech of gulls behind. In the days that followed, King's Landing felt almost lighter, as though a great storm cloud had departed. The small folk went about their business with fewer Ironborn roaming the streets, and Daenerys had one less worry to dominate her thoughts. She held audiences, convened the small council, and listened to Tyrion's reports on the realm. Missandei catalogued the crown's finances. Varys whispered of intrigues from the Vale to Dorne. Grey Worm remained busy training new recruits to bolster the city's guard. Yara Greyjoy, for her part, took a measured interest in the Iron Islands. She sent ravens to key captains, forging subtle alliances should Euron's campaign fail or should he overstep his bounds upon returning. Daenerys approved of this behind closed doors, for Euron's unpredictability warranted a backup plan. Still, she did not openly encourage Yara's ambitions. Best to keep the Ironborn question simmering quietly, to avoid sparking an open fracture in House Greyjoy while their lord was away. Months passed. News arrived sporadically of Euron's campaign in the Stepstones. Tales of fierce battles against pirate lords, references to great storms that battered the fleet, and rumors of entire pirate enclaves burned to cinders. The Ironborn reaped considerable treasure. One letter, penned in Euron's scrawling hand, boasted of capturing a dozen pirate ships and claiming a prize chest filled with gold coin, rubies, and emeralds. He promised to present the finest spoils to his queen upon his triumphant return. Daenerys read these dispatches with a mixture of relief and caution. She hoped that as long as Euron was slaking his thirst for violence on pirates, he would not turn his attention back to Westerosi shores. Yet she did not entirely trust the veracity of his reports. Perhaps he exaggerated his victories to mask hidden agendas, or to conceal certain losses. She could only wait and see what the future held. In the meantime, her own rule took shape. She appointed local governors for each region, working to mend the fractures left by war. She reopened trade routes with Essos, forging alliances with cities that had once welcomed her presence, like Volantis and Pentos. Her dragons, Drogon and Regal, ranged further each day, patrolling the skies around King's Landing, roosting in distant hills. Their presence unnerved some, but it kept potential rebels in check. Occasionally, she felt a pang of loneliness, recalling the days when she had soared over vast deserts on Dragonback, or the nights spent in the meandering city of Meereen with Dario Naharis spinning wild tales. Now she was a queen with a husband she barely tolerated, alliances to maintain, and a kingdom to rebuild. There was little time for the freedoms she once had. But she steeled herself, reminding her heart that her people, and the legacy of House Targaryen, must come first. At last, word came that Euron was returning in triumph. A scout ship arrived at the mouth of the Blackwater, bearing news of the Iron Fleet's approach. Daenerys gathered her court to prepare for a formal welcome, though she wondered what sort of triumphant parade Euron might demand. Tyrion was cautious, reminding her that they should carefully inspect whatever cargo or spoils he brought with him. Yara looked guarded, uncertain whether Euron's success would strengthen her own standing or diminish it. The city braced for the return of the Ironborn Reavers. When the Iron Fleet at last appeared on the horizon, it was a magnificent sight. Scores of war galleys, their sails patched but proud, ringed the waters outside King's Landing. Some looked battered from storms. Others displayed fresh coats of paint depicting krakens in gold and black. Daenerys stood on the quay, flanked by her Unsullied, as Euron's flagship docked with a great splash of water against the pylons. She wore a dragon-scale cloak, her silver hair braided, her expression regal. Euron strode down the plank with a swagger, his coat adorned with new tokens, a necklace of sea-green pearls, a broad belt studded with rubies, and a dagger at his hip that glinted with Valyrian steel. He bowed dramatically before Daenerys. Behind him, his crew lugged heavy chests brimming with gold, carved idols from far-flung isles, and crates that rattled with unknown contents. "My queen!" Euron declared loudly, ensuring that the gathered onlookers heard him. "I return from the Stepstones victorious. The pirates are scattered, their dens burned, their ships claimed, and I bring you the spoils of war." Daenerys stepped forward, lifting her chin. "I welcome you home, my king." The formal greeting felt strange on her tongue. "We thank you for your service to the realm. Show us the spoils, so all may see the fruits of this expedition." Euron nodded to his men, who pried open one of the chests. Gold coins spilled out, glimmering in the sunlight. Another chest revealed jewelry, strings of pearls, rings of jade and silver. A third chest contained curiosities, exotic spices from pirate markets, carved dragonbone figurines, the eggs of monstrous serpents. The watching crowd murmured in awe. Tyrion stepped forward to inspect a handful of coins, verifying their authenticity. "It seems you've done well," Daenerys said, meeting Euron's eyes. She reminded herself that she was the queen, that she had to project unity and gratitude in front of her people. "The crown appreciates your efforts. The trade routes through the Stepstones will be safer now, thanks to your actions." Euron laughed, turning to address the crowd that had gathered. "Safer indeed. Let the merchants rejoice, for I, Euron Greyjoy, have purged the sea of scum. And let those who doubt our queen's might tremble." He gestured at the cargo. "For see what happens to those who stand against us." Daenerys spotted several bound prisoners in ragged clothes, presumably captured pirates. They were gaunt, eyes filled with fear or defiance. Euron waved a hand in their direction. "A gift to you, my queen, fresh souls who dared defy our rule. Do with them as you will." Daenerys felt a flicker of revulsion. She had no desire to parade captives like trophies, but the crowd's bloodlust was piqued, some calling for execution, others for enslavement. She lifted a hand for silence. "They shall be imprisoned until we determine their fate," she announced, resolving to investigate each case, or at least to appear just. Euron accepted her decision with a carefree shrug. "As you wish." He turned back to Daenerys, lowering his voice. "Now that we have done our duty, might we enjoy the spoils of our victory? A feast, perhaps, to celebrate our alliance's success." Daenerys nodded. "There will be a feast tonight in the Red Keep to welcome you home. The city shall share in the bounty." It was a carefully managed affair. Musicians played lively tunes, courtiers pressed in to see the new treasures, and some of the gold coin was distributed among the people to foster goodwill. Euron drank and boasted, regaling the court with exaggerated tales of how he personally cut down 3 pirate lords and took their flagship. Daenerys remained poised at his side, occasionally interjecting to ensure he did not claim too much personal credit for the victory. She reminded the listeners that it was the crown's expedition, that these spoils were shared for the benefit of the realm. Throughout the night, she noticed the way Euron seemed to lap up the praise, the eyes of the crowd. He strutted about, a peacock among hens, collecting compliments from lords and ladies who once might have sneered at the Ironborn but were now enchanted by the glitter of his success. Underneath it all, Daenerys felt a chill. This was a man who thrived on adulation, who would not remain content with half measures. Sooner or later, he would want more. For a time, however, the realm saw relative peace. Trade caravans arrived more frequently at King's Landing, buoyed by news that the Stepstones were no longer a haven for pirates. The gold from Euron's expedition helped refill the royal treasury. Daenerys used it to rebuild parts of the city still in ruins, to restore roads across the Crownlands, and to fund relief for small folk still recovering from the war. Euron cared little for these uses of the spoils, so long as he had enough coin to reward his captains. Yet the tension between them grew. They argued behind closed doors, usually about the treatment of captives, the management of the Iron Islands, or Euron's repeated demands for further campaigns abroad. He spoke of conquering parts of Essos, of turning the Iron Fleet into a global terror that would surpass even the legends of the ancient Valyrians. Daenerys refused, insisting that her priority was stabilizing Westeros. She would not spill more blood overseas when her own people needed her. One late evening, when the torches sputtered in the corridors, and the flicker of candlelight made shadows dance along the stone walls, Daenerys and Euron clashed fiercely in their private chambers. The door was barred, yet their raised voices echoed within. "You are queen of the 7 kingdoms," Euron thundered, pacing near the hearth. "Yet you let petty lords bicker and stall your rule. You should be crushing them or leading me to crush them. Instead, you waste time dealing with trifles and rebuilding hovels." Daenerys stood by a table strewn with maps and reports. Her face was pale with anger, her voice low. "I will not rule a kingdom of ashes. These people have endured too much war. My wars, Cersei's wars, the war of the 5 kings before that. Enough blood has been spilled. I seek to unify and rebuild, not destroy." Euron slammed a fist on the mantle, sending sparks into the air. "You talk of unity, but half these lords would slit your throat if given the chance. Fear is what keeps them in line. My Ironborn fear me, and so they follow me. That is how the world works." Daenerys met his gaze with defiance. "There are other ways to rule than fear alone. You claim to be my consort, but you undermine me at every turn. If you cannot respect my authority, we have no alliance." He stared at her, eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat? Are you going to sick your dragons on me, my queen? Burn my fleet." She took a step toward him, the anger in her chest matching the coiling tension in his. "If it comes to that, yes. I will do what I must to protect this kingdom from chaos. If you betray our vows, I will not hesitate." Euron's laughter was hollow, echoing off the walls. "Brave words. But I know you, Daenerys Targaryen. You need my ships. You'll not burn them all. Not if you wish to keep control of the seas." Their gazes locked, neither yielding. At length, Daenerys forced herself to turn away, exhaling slowly. "I will not be threatened in my own castle," she said, voice quieter now but no less firm. "We are done here, Euron. Leave me." He lingered a moment, nostrils flared. Then he strode to the door, unbarred it, and left without another word. The slam of the door reverberated through the chamber. Daenerys was left alone, trembling in the aftermath, uncertain how much longer this marriage of convenience could hold before it destroyed them both. Time slipped by, the courtly life continuing despite the undercurrent of discord. The tension between the queen and her consort became an open secret. Courtiers whispered about their quarrels, took note of how seldom they shared a dinner table, and speculated on what might happen if Euron decided to break away. Tyrion and Missandei worked tirelessly to keep matters from boiling over, while Yara discreetly contacted more Ironborn captains, preparing for a potential showdown. Daenerys felt like she was riding the razor's edge of a storm, trying to keep the realm from splitting under her feet. Then came a piece of news that would change everything. A raven arrived from the north, where winter still clung to the mountains and forests. The message was terse. A new threat had emerged, a claimant rumored to be a Targaryen bastard, rallying discontented bannermen in the Vale and the Riverlands. They had begun to call him the Black Dragon, a pretender who styled himself Aegon. Daenerys read the words in dismay and anger. Another war, another pretender. It seemed the realm would never be free from such strife. Word spread quickly. Lords whispered about this so-called Aegon, claiming he was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen by Elia Martell, thought long dead but now miraculously returned. Daenerys had heard these rumors before she first came to Westeros. Varys had once alluded to a secret Targaryen heir in Essos, but the spider had insisted that child perished or was never truly of the blood. Now that story gained new life, stirring dissent among lords who had yet to fully embrace Daenerys' rule. Sitting on the Iron Throne, Daenerys called a council to address this threat. Tyrion stood at her right, Grey Worm and Missandei beside him. Yara was there, arms folded, listening with a scowl. Euron arrived late, taking his seat with a careless air. Daenerys explained what they knew. The pretender was gathering forces at Harrenhal, forging alliances with disaffected houses. The details were vague, but the threat was real. If left unchecked, it could spiral into open rebellion. "We must act swiftly," Daenerys declared. "If these rebels gather enough strength, we could face another drawn-out war. The realm cannot endure more bloodshed." Tyrion spoke next. "A show of force might be enough to discourage them. If we march north with dragons and the Iron Fleet at our backs, the lords may hesitate to join a pretender's cause." Yara nodded. "If Euron can secure the waters along the coast near Crackclaw Point, we can cut off any supplies coming by sea from the Vale. That would leave them reliant on land routes, which we can control with the Unsullied and Dothraki." Euron leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "So you want me to sail north with the Iron Fleet? Blockade the Vale, starve them out, is that it?" Daenerys' gaze settled on him. "Yes, as king consort you will command the naval forces. We move together swiftly. I will take the dragons, the Unsullied, and the Dothraki along the King's Road. We will converge on Harrenhal before this pretender can grow stronger." Euron tapped his fingers on the table. "And if we succeed, you'll be rid of another challenger. If we fail, we may lose half the realm." "We will not fail," Daenerys said firmly. "I faced worse threats and emerged victorious. The North remembers my fight against the Night King. Now the realm will see that I protect the throne from any usurper." He shrugged. "Very well. I'll gather the fleet. We leave in a fortnight, yes?" Daenerys nodded. "Yes. Have your ships ready by then." As the council dispersed, Daenerys wondered if this new conflict might either unite her and Euron in a common cause, or drive them further apart. She had no illusions. Euron might see this as an opportunity to carve out more power for himself. But she had no choice. The realm depended on a swift response, and the Iron Fleet was a key part of that strategy. Over the next weeks, preparations were made. The city bustled with activity as soldiers gathered, supplies were loaded, and ravens flew to loyal houses, calling them to arms. Daenerys' dragons circled above, their silhouettes passing over the rooftops in silent warning. Euron's Ironborn roamed the harbor, loading their war galleys with weapons. Yara worked discreetly to ensure that if the tide turned, enough captains would remain loyal to Daenerys over Euron. On the appointed day, Daenerys led her host from King's Landing, a column of Unsullied in gleaming spears and shields, followed by the Dothraki outriders, savage and eager for battle. Tyrion traveled with her, along with Missandei. Grey Worm commanded the infantry. The plan was simple: encircle Harrenhal, cut off the rebels from the Vale, and force the pretender to yield or fight a hopeless battle. If he dared stand against Dragonfire, so be it. Euron and the Iron Fleet slipped away from Blackwater Bay at dawn, their black sails fading into the distance. Daenerys watched from a vantage point on the city walls, wondering if he would return with victory or with betrayal. Then she turned her mount northward, spurring her horse down the King's Road, Drogon and Regal flying overhead in great sweeping arcs. The ground shook with the thunder of hooves and marching feet. As the royal army advanced, Daenerys fought down a sense of dread. She had once promised herself she would not be the cause of more suffering. Yet here she was again, leading a war host to crush another pretender. Perhaps this was the price of power in Westeros. Endless conflict, endless ambition. She could only hope that, by quashing this rebellion swiftly, she might spare the realm a longer, more devastating civil war. Days bled into nights as the army marched. Scouts reported that the rebels were fortifying Harrenhal, gathering men from the Riverlands, the Vale, and a smattering of Stormland knights eager for plunder. Rumors swirled that the pretender had Targaryen features, hair of silver gold, eyes of deep violet, but Daenerys refused to lend credence to such tales without proof. If he was truly of her blood, it changed nothing. The throne was hers by birth, by conquest, and by the recognition of the realm. Closer they came to the cursed towers of Harrenhal, their twisted spires looming against the horizon like jagged bones. Smoke drifted from the castle's many chimneys, a sign that the pretender was indeed within. Daenerys planned to circle the fortress with her ground forces, while Euron's fleet would blockade the eastern shoreline, preventing any relief from the Vale. But as Daenerys approached with her vanguard, a sudden shock came. A messenger arrived from Euron Greyjoy, breathless and wide-eyed. He reported that the Iron Fleet had encountered a storm near Crackclaw Point. Several ships had been lost, scattered along the rocky coast. Euron's flagship had survived, and he had pressed on with half the fleet to blockade the Bay of Crabs. But the letter was vague about losses and the state of the blockade. Daenerys cursed under her breath. The plan to strangle the rebels might be compromised if the blockade was weakened. The Pretender's forces could slip through by sea or muster allies from the Vale. She had no choice but to continue onward, hoping that Euron would regroup in time. If not, the siege would grow bloodier. Before she could formulate a new plan, another messenger arrived from the advanced scouts. A large cavalry force bearing the banner of the Black Dragon was heading south, perhaps aiming to intercept Daenerys' host before it reached Harrenhal. It seemed the pretender was not content to remain behind his walls. Tyrion called for caution, suggesting they entrench and await reinforcements. Grey Worm advised pressing forward, using the dragons to shatter the enemy cavalry in an open field. Daenerys weighed their counsel, torn between caution and aggression. Eventually, she decided to rely on the dragons, a tool no other pretender could match. With Grey Worm and the Unsullied forming a solid core, the Dothraki would flank the enemy cavalry. Daenerys herself would take to the skies on Drogon, with Regal following at a distance under the guidance of her remaining dragon keepers. They would strike fear into the rebel host, break them before they could mount an organized assault. It was a brutal tactic, but Daenerys reminded herself that a swift victory was kinder in the long run than a protracted war. The two forces met on a wide plain dotted with low hills and scattered copses of trees. The rebel cavalry, perhaps 5,000 strong, arrayed themselves under banners of black and red, an inverted Targaryen sigil that rankled Daenerys' pride. She watched from above, astride Drogon, as they formed their ranks. At their head rode a knight in dark armor, a proud banner streaming behind him. Could he be the rumored pretender, or one of his lieutenants? When the horns sounded, the Dothraki riders thundered forth from the sides, their aurochs gleaming, war cries splitting the air. The Unsullied advanced methodically from the center, shields locked. Daenerys urged Drogon higher, feeling the rush of wind in her face. She eyed the mass of horsemen below, scanning for their leader. Then she dived, fire in her throat, unleashing a torrent of dragon flame that lit up the battlefield with an orange glow. Screams rose, horses bolted in terror, men scattered. The rebel lines wavered. Another burst of flame, and an entire flank of cavalry broke, riding for the rear in a desperate attempt to escape. Regal swooped in from the other side, a roar echoing across the plain. The Dothraki poured through the gaps, cutting down those who stood. It was a swift, devastating blow. Few armies could stand against dragons in an open field. In less than an hour, the rebel cavalry was in tatters. Hundreds lay dead or wounded, their banners trampled in the mud. The black dragon banner fell, its bearer cut down by a Dothraki KO. Daenerys circled overhead, scanning for any sign of the pretender. She spotted a small cluster of knights retreating, some bearing the black dragon on their shields. She directed Drogon to follow, unleashing a final gout of flame that consumed half of them, leaving a handful alive, galloping away in terror. By midday, the field belonged to Daenerys. The crows were already circling, drawn by the stench of burnt flesh. Grey Worm and the Unsullied methodically rounded up prisoners, while Tyrion led a smaller detachment to question any knights or lords who might yield. A shadow of sorrow flickered through Daenerys as she dismounted from Drogon, stepping onto scorched grass. Another battle, another hillside strewn with the dead. She could hear the wails of the dying, the muffled whinnies of wounded horses. "Your Grace," Tyrion said softly as he approached, flecks of blood on his boots. "We have captured a few knights of some standing. One of them claims the pretender is still at Harrenhal. This was but a probing force." Daenerys nodded wearily. "Very well. Gather what information you can." She turned to look at the devastation, the smoke curling from blackened earth. This was the price of challenges to her reign, the cost of being the dragon. As she gazed at the distant silhouette of Harrenhal, she thought of Euron at sea, the uncertain blockade, and the pretender who waited behind those ancient walls. She wondered how many more would have to die before this war ended. That night, the Targaryen camp settled near the battlefield. Patrols were sent out, scouts checked the roads, and the dragons roost on a rise overlooking the plain. Daenerys took a sparse meal in her command tent, feeling the weight of command settle more heavily on her shoulders. Missandei tried to lift her spirits with gentle words, but Daenerys could not banish the memory of burning men alive from her mind. Tomorrow they would continue onward. Sooner or later, they would meet the pretender's main force, or they would lay siege to Harrenhal itself. If Euron managed his blockade, no relief would come from the Vale. Daenerys hoped the sight of 2 dragons scorching the rebel cavalry would be enough to dishearten the pretender, to make him yield before more lives were lost. But she knew well that ambition and pride often triumphed over reason. As the flicker of torchlight danced against the canvas walls of her tent, Daenerys stared into the darkness, contemplating the precarious balance of her reign. She was a queen bound to a kraken, forced to quell insurrections from those who questioned her birthright. She had dreamed once of a peaceful rule, a realm free of tyrants and warlords. Yet each day, she found herself wading deeper into blood, and still, she pressed on. For if she faltered, everything she had built would come crashing down, like a grand castle of sand swept away by the tide. So the night passed, heavy with foreboding. The wind carried the distant cries of wounded men, and the dragons rumbled in uneasy slumber. Daenerys closed her eyes, wondering what fresh hells the dawn would bring, and whether this marriage to Euron Greyjoy would be her salvation or her undoing. Somewhere, across the waters, Euron sailed with a fleet that might dictate the realm's fate. Ahead, in the looming bastion of Harrenhal, a pretender who claimed Targaryen blood summoned new allies to his cause. The wheel of power turned, and Daenerys clung to its rim, determined not to be crushed, determined to hold the throne she had fought so long to claim. She whispered a silent prayer to the gods she barely believed in anymore, praying that she would emerge from this trial not as the next mad tyrant, but as a queen worthy of the legacy she bore. But the gods, as ever, were silent, leaving her alone with the burdens of crown and crownless foes alike. And so she waited for the light of day, prepared to set the realm ablaze once more, if that was the price for peace.